a minute here. So thank you all for coming. We're going to give just another half minute to get everyone out of the waiting room and into our gathering. So I want to welcome everyone to our For the People teach-in this evening. My name is Mary Ann Comfort. I'm a member of the Justice Team for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. And I'm really thrilled to greet all of you on behalf of the Justice Team, our Mercy Office of Anti-Racism and Racial Equity, and the Franciscan Action Network. We're gathered today at a very important moment for our democracy. Our teach-in is the kickoff of 2 days filled with similar educational events. They're being planned by members of the Faithful Democracy Coalition to show that people of faith are committed to passing the For the People Act. Tonight, we're going to be reminded of the history of voter suppression and the struggles for voting rights in the US, and hear some personal experiences from grassroots work. Then we'll give you a chance to process what you've heard. And finally, we'll tell you more about the For the People Act, why it's so important, and what we can do to help push it through the Senate. We were really heartened and surprised to know that more than 350 people have registered for this event, which is beyond what we could have imagined. So to maintain a respectful forum for our speakers and for all of you participants, we've muted everyone and we've disabled the chat among participants so that doesn't become distracting. We do invite you to use the chat. You can chat to the co-hosts to pose any questions you have for speakers, and we'll gather up the questions we can't answer tonight and send them out in a follow-up email that we'll be sending out by early next week with more resources for you. Our hope is to give you a bit of education, a bit of inspiration and motivation, and a call to action over the next few weeks. As I said, we will be following up with you on with some more resources early next week so that we can give you some guidance for action and give you some more resources. So this is who we are today. We are part of the Faithful Democracy Forum on For the People Act. And I would ask folks if you would unmute yourself, that would be really helpful so that we can focus on our speakers. And Anna, if you can be attentive to that too, that would be really helpful. So we're gathered here this evening, and as we always do together, we are going to open with prayer. And I'm really pleased that Barita Singleton is going to lead us in prayer. She is a Mercy Associate, and she's also a member of the Coordinating Committee of the Mercy Office of Anti-Racism and Racial Equity.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Good evening, and let us pray. God of mercy, our nation faces many challenges these days. With all of the injustice and fear in our world today, we ask you to inspire us and guide us as we pray for all those citizens who have their voting rights denied unjustly. We seek a government that upholds and protects human rights and justice for all its citizens, regardless of race, class, gender, or religion. Move and inspire us by your presence among us in the most vulnerable in our society. For their tears are your tears. Their pain is your pain. Their suffering is your suffering. In gratitude for the right to vote, we pray in the name of your Son, Jesus, our brother, and let the church say, Amen.
Amen.
We shall live in peace. Oh, sing it out. And Lord, we shall overcome.
Thank you so much, Burita. It was such an uplifting way to start our evening together. And it's that I think should become the anthem of the struggle to pass the For the People Act, because we know there's lots to overcome: the filibuster, the slim majority of our lawmakers who have made a commitment to passing this legislation. So really perfectly set our the tone of our time together. I'm now real pleased to welcome Dr. Kristen Matson. She's a professor of political science at the Mercy-sponsored College of St. Mary in Omaha, Nebraska, and director of the college's service learning program. So Dr. Matson, we welcome you.
Thank you. I was not muted, but thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you this evening and to talk about voter suppression. Very, very excited to be with you, particularly as we talk about the For the People Act and organizing in advance of the 2024 election. There's been a lot of talk recently about threats to American democracy. Some of you may be aware that American democracy has been downgraded by a number of international watchdogs, listed as a flawed democracy or a democracy at risk. And when we're talking about democracy and threats to democracy, what we're talking about in large part is threats to the vote. So we all know that in a representative democracy, the people rule with their vote. I have to remember to advance my slide, sorry. We all know that in a representative democracy, the people rule by using their vote to elect representatives to serve their interests. Healthy democracies require institutions and norms to support the people's rule and protect that vote. We need voting laws that provide access and eliminate barriers to the vote. We need processes to manage the fair collection and reporting of the vote to keep partisan influences out of the electoral process. And we need processes and norms that empower the vote, that certify the election results and facilitate the transfer of power. Currently, particularly since the 2020 election, we see threats to all three of these vote supports. We see increasing inroads for partisan influences in the electoral process. Political leaders are questioning the legitimacy of the certified vote, and we're seeing an uneasy transfer of power, and we see widespread voter intimidation and suppression. The potential consequences of this cannot be overstated. Recently, a group of political scientists issued a statement of concern about the state of American democracy and the threat that current suppression and the attacks on elections represent to American democracy. And I am going to read an excerpt from it in full because I think it's very powerful. Democracy rests on certain elemental institutional and normative conditions. The refusal of prominent Republicans to accept the outcome of the 2020 election and the anti-democratic laws adopted or approaching adoption in Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Montana, and Texas, and under serious consideration in other Republican-controlled states, violate these principles. More profoundly, these actions call into question whether the United States will remain a democracy. As scholars of democracy, we condemn these actions in the strongest possible terms as a betrayal of our precious democratic heritage. Our democracy is fundamentally at stake. History will judge what we do at this moment. So a powerful statement, I think, talking about our precious democratic heritage. And so I want to talk, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the history of voter suppression, the history of voting rights in the United States. And so when we talk about our precious democratic heritage, our precious democratic heritage is a lot younger than a lot of us would like to think. So the US was not founded as a democracy. It was at the founding, only white male property owners could vote. The property owning qualifications largely had been eliminated by the early 1800s, but the first broad expansion of the vote came with the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment was one of the Civil War amendments. So 13th Amendment freed the slaves, 14th Amendment granted citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment offered the right to vote, so that the right to vote could not be abridged on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So when the 15th Amendment was passed, the Southern states, in order to re-enter the Union, had to ratify. They had to ratify the 15th Amendment in order to gain entrance into the Union. And the North occupied the South and provided the protection that Black voters needed in order to vote. And we saw during Reconstruction, which was a short period of time from roughly 1870 to 1877, we saw a broad increase in, or dramatic, very profound increase in growth in Black voting and Black office holding. We saw Black people elected to offices across the South during Reconstruction. That growth in voting was short-lived, however. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. In the Compromise of 1877, the Republican Party solidified control of the national government, and in exchange, it pulled its troops out of the South. So it did away with those protections that it gave to Black voters. And what the Southern states did in response was to begin to, they used their control over the conduct of their own elections to begin to create laws which appear to be neutral on their face, but were intended to and did disenfranchise African-American voters. This is when we saw the literacy tests, the poll taxes, the grandfather clause, etc. These laws, combined with an extreme campaign of violence and lynching, worked to disenfranchise African-American voters in the South almost completely. And so that statistic that I have at the bottom shows you the effect of the Reconstruction and the North's support of African-American voting from 1870 to 1877. And then when the North pulls the troops out and the Southern states enact this voter suppression. So in Mississippi, at the height of Reconstruction, 67% of African-American were registered to vote. By 1950, 3% of African Americans were registered to vote in the state of Mississippi. So this is the very quick tour of history. So I'm talking about the civil rights movement in a very short amount of time, but we kind of fast forward to the end of World War II. African American soldiers fought in World War II. We have seen the kind of complete disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South through these laws through the Jim Crow laws. We start to see the organization of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s with voting rights as its kind of key focus. These years and years of advocating and organizing culminates with an event that we're all familiar with and that is pictured in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. The voting rights advocates march in Selma across the Pettus Bridge, where they were peaceful, unarmed protesters protesting for the right to vote, were beaten by the police, and that was broadcast on the nightly news. And so that the visual of that disgusted the American population enough that maybe that's a hint for us in terms of organizing, in terms of visual events, not that we should be beaten, but the importance of being visual. But that gave enough of an impetus for Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So again, back to Mississippi. So in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, 6.7% of African Americans were registered to vote. 2 years later, so that gives you a sense of the impact of the Voting Rights Act. 2 years later, almost 60% of African Americans were registered to vote. Many scholars say that the US did not become a democracy until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So again, that precious democratic heritage has not been as long as some of us would like to think. But now that Voting Rights Act is under threat, as are the voting rights and the democracy that it protects. The first substantial blow to the Voting Rights Act came in 2013, with Shelby County versus Holder. And Shelby County versus Holder, what the case did was that under the Voting Rights Act, states that had a documented history of discriminatory practices had to obtain pre-clearance from the Justice Department in order to implement new laws, new voting laws. And so what the court decided was that times had changed and that discrimination was no longer as rampant as it had been when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And so states that had to get pre-clearance were being unfairly disadvantaged. So they said the formula was outdated and they threw out pre-clearance. And this was what prompted Justice Ginsburg's famous dissent, where she said, throwing out pre-clearance when it worked and is continuing to work is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. The effect of Shelby County case was substantial. Texas immediately implemented a restrictive voter ID law, and many other conservative states followed very quickly. We saw restrictions such as voter ID, restrictions on early voting, narrowing of the registration process, poll closings, etc. That threat has intensified now after the 2020 election. And I won't read this quote, but maybe some of you saw or heard Biden's remarks earlier this month talking about the crisis that we face. And I think he talks about the crisis that we face in terms of the attack on the right to vote and the attack on free and fair elections. And his ending part where he says, I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying this because you should be alarmed. Goes back again to that those political scientists. History will judge us for what we do at this point, and the threat to democracy cannot be overstated. In the wake of the 2020 election, we have seen the intensifying of the threat. We've seen increased partisan influence over the electoral process. The Georgia legislature now can suspend county election officials. We have seen the threats to the legitimacy of the vote and the democratic process, where the former president has not acknowledged the legitimacy of the vote. And we witnessed an insurrection on January 6th in an attempt to block the certification of that vote. And we've seen a flurry of states passing voter suppression laws, which, though largely neutral on their face, disproportionately impact people of color, not dissimilar from the effect that the laws that were passed by the South at the end of Reconstruction. So we have seen since the election of 2020, we've seen 17 states have passed legislation limiting voting rights. Texas is, some of you are probably watching the dynamics regarding Texas, where some of the legislature has gone to DC so as to prevent the enacting of the restrictive voter laws. But we have seen in these 17 states, voter ID, signature match, limiting mail-in voting, shortening the early voting period, limiting access to drop boxes, et cetera, all ways to suppress and limit access to the vote. In that context, again, we saw the Supreme Court in Shelby County, that being a big case that enabled voter suppression. Just earlier this month, the Supreme Court issued another case and issued another decision, and another decision which was an undercutting decision of the Voting Rights Act. Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee. The Shelby County case dealt with Section 5. What Brnovich deals with is a different section of the law, Section 2, which says that it's not about pre-certification, but it's about states can bring, or people can bring suits that a voting law that's passed is discriminatory in effect and have that thrown out. And so what the court decided is that in this case is they expanded the range of legitimate state actions that could not be thrown out if they had a discriminatory impact, and they increased the level of discriminatory impact that must be demonstrated before a law could be thrown out. So now we have no preclearance, and we also have laws that have a discriminatory impact. You have to demonstrate substantial discriminatory impact. A little discriminatory impact, according to the recent court decision, is okay. So I'm going to leave it there pretty much. That's the mess that we find ourselves in right now. I know that this is about organizing for and learning more about the For the People Act. We also have the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019 that was passed by the House in 2019, but that's still somewhat in the mix as a voting reform. The general wisdom is that the Congress holds the largest potential to address some of these issues that we need to have addressed, but that's a relatively bleak position to be in. So it's going to take a lot of organizing to get HR 1 passed. And so I'm happy to be here tonight to start or to join that process.
Thank you so much, Kristen. That was so helpful to give some of the history and background of what we're moving into in this current time period. And I think giving the history and the statistics on the changes in voter registration after the Voting Rights Act really shows the importance of defending that and the various sections in there. And we'll get into the legislation that we're going to be advocating for that'll help that. I also want to say that the visual from Selma was certainly very powerful, and it was literally on the backs and the abuse of our Black sisters and brothers. And so I see that as an invitation, or what are the visuals that we need in 2021 that are have all of us there, and thinking of the Poor People's Campaign and folks who were there at Washington, D.C. yesterday. And there's opportunities to join the Poor People's Campaign in state capitals next Monday as well, where they're calling for this For the People Act to pass, as well as others. So I think thinking about what are the visuals that have all of us involved and showing that what needs to be done. And I'm really very pleased to have with us next Tracy Horton. She is a Mercy Associate and has been employed by the Sisters of Mercy for 11 years. And she's based in our Belmont, North Carolina office. And she's been doing quite a bit of on-the-ground work around voting registration and elections. And she has some really compelling experiences to share with us. So welcome, Tracy, and please, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Marianne. For this past election cycle, I wanted to get involved and get out there and help do something. So I started a voter registration drive. And I went to a shopping center that had a lot of traffic and had predominantly Black people going through there. And myself and Sister Rosemary, we went to a beauty supply, and every Saturday for about 2 months, stood in front of the beauty supply and tried to get people to register to vote. And my experience told me that voter suppression tactics have worked. They have worked to make people feel hopeless, like their vote won't count, like they shouldn't be voting. That's not what they do. And it was very disheartening to see that. Some people were even upset that they were being stopped to ask to vote, as if it was an insult. So that was my experience there. But I did get some people to register. The form that I had was when I ordered from the election office, and the instructions were the blocks in red need to be filled out, need to be completed. So I didn't have much of their time. So I said, fill out everything in red and you'll be fine. So I took all of these down to the election office, and the woman told me, oh, no, they have to fill out these 3 or 4 other blocks as well. We can't accept those. So I thought, my goodness, this is hard. So then I had to write postcards to everyone and ask them, please come back to the beauty supply, redo your form. They won't accept it. And no one responded. So then I also volunteered to be a vote protector on the night of the election. And I'll just tell you the story of one woman who pulled up in the parking lot. She got out of her car and walked halfway to the door and turned around and walked back to her car. And I ran over to ask, like, what's the matter? Why aren't you voting? And she said, well, my kids are in the car. You know, I just got off work. They're hungry, that type of thing. So my son was with me. And I asked him to watch her kids for her in the car while she goes to go vote. And so she went, and she came back shortly after that. And I asked, did you vote? No. And I said, why didn't you vote? And she says, they don't want me to vote. And so I went in to ask what the problem was. And it just turns out one of the volunteers was uninformed and had given her some bad information. And rather than giving her a provisional ballot, they just sent her away. So these are things, and so she was discouraged, felt like she shouldn't be there anyhow. And she was ready to just go home without even, voting provisionally. So these are just some of the things I experienced in just 2 months of trying to be a part of the solution. And I understand why many Black people don't vote. There's so much against the idea of it. And it just tells me that we have to just work even harder and start earlier to get people engaged and educated.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Really powerful. It's important to hear those stories.
You're welcome.
Very grateful. We'll have some time for questions and answers later. So there may be some questions for Kristen and Tracy later, but I think it's really important to put together the kind of the history and the academic studies of where we've come to here with some really real life, very recent experiences to know that this isn't just something of the history books, but something that we're dealing with right today. So I appreciate both of them joining us for that. In the meantime, we are going to, so happy to have with us Jason Miller, who I work with in a lot of spaces. He is with Franciscan Action Network, and he's the co-chair of the Faithful Democracy Working Group. So welcome, Jason. And he is going to wrap it up with, now that we've heard so much about the need to address voter suppression and protect voting rights, he's going to tell us how to do that. So take it away, Jason.
Thank you so much, Mary Ann. And I don't promise to have all the solutions, but I hope to have some of them. So let me just share my screen and we will go from there. Okay. So why democracy? Before I answer that question, let me first tell you a little bit. There we go. Now my slides will change. Tell you about who I am. So as Mary Ann said, my name is Jason Miller. I'm a faith-based advocate, organizer, and activist at the Franciscan Action Network. I'm also the co-facilitator of the Faithful Democracy Campaign. And that is a coalition of faith-based denominations and organizations based mainly in Washington, D.C., who work on issues of voting rights and getting big money out of politics. I've worked on a wide variety of campaigns in my about 10 years working in this faith advocacy space. Worked with the Nuns on the Bus in Ohio, with Fast for Families, the People's Climate Movement, you name it, I've done it. I am that guy. So why democracy? why should democracy be everyone's first issue? We know that as people of faith, we have many issues that we care about: the environment, immigration, gun violence prevention, poverty. You could probably name even more issues. Well, democracy needs to be everyone's first issue, in my opinion, because democracy needs to get fixed first before any of these other issues can get fixed on Capitol Hill. And why should people of faith care about democracy issues? Well, we know that all human beings have dignity. All human beings have worth. And we also believe that, and I believe that, as in order for all Americans to show that they have that dignity and worth, their voice needs to be counted at the ballot box, and their voice should not be drowned out by big money in politics. We've seen this happen throughout history, and we're seeing it happen again today with these different voter suppression laws. So we also know that there is a connection between issues that people of faith care about and these democracy issues, especially with big money in politics. We know that if you care about the environment, the Koch brothers give lots of dark money to candidates and to politicians. We know that if you care about immigration, private prisons are influencing a lot of what we're seeing on the immigration issue. We know that gun violence, think about the NRA and the money that they give and use to prop up political candidates. So we know that there's all these other issues that we care about as people of faith, but because human beings have dignity and worth, and because we want these other issues to be fixed, we need to first fix democracy. And of course, there's good old Pope Francis, our favorite. It seems like eons ago, he was at the Capitol in the joint session of Congress. And he says that as Catholics and people of goodwill, we need to meddle in politics. So I'm here to meddle, and I hope you're all going to join me in meddling. So we've heard tonight about the For the People Act. I am at the Congress pre-COVID when they introduced HR1, the For the People Act. And but we've heard about this bill tonight, but what is it exactly? Well, it's a landmark piece of legislation. It's divided in what we say 3 buckets. I've mentioned 2 of them so far. We have our voting rights, we have money in politics, and then we also have ethics reform. And we just passed the 1-year anniversary of Congressman John Lewis's death. He wrote a good portion of the voting rights bucket of the bill. So it's a landmark, huge piece of legislation. It's a big deal. It's why it's HR1, it's why it's S1 in the Senate. And we don't want to see it broken up in the Congress. It needs to move as one bill. It's also, and this is important to add, the only piece of legislation that will push back against the 389 voter suppression bills that are being introduced in 48 states. We heard earlier, it's now 17 states where the voter suppression bills have turned into voter suppression laws. Some people may say, oh, well, what about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? Well, those are 2 important bookends to ensuring that all Americans have an equal say at the ballot box. But the For the People Act is the only piece of legislation that will overturn, or you can then take to court, all of these voter suppression bills that have passed at the statewide level. So that's why it's so important. You may hear from some people that, oh, well, what about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? Can't we have that instead? Well, no, we need the For the People Act first, because it's going to be the only piece of legislation that removes these voter suppression laws and can challenge these bills. And it also tackles big money in politics. It tackles gerrymandering. We look at voter ID. People say, well, I'm a voter. I have a driver's license. Doesn't everyone have a driver's license? Well, in fact, 20% of Americans do not have a photo ID. And so it might sound like a common sense thing to us. Well, don't we all have photo IDs? But 20% of Americans don't. And that's why something like that is a form of voter suppression. And we need the For the People Act to push back against these forms of voter suppression. Okay, there we are at the DC statehood rally just a few days ago. Sister Rosemarie, who couldn't join us this evening, I mentioned the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and what about that? And what about DC statehood? Well, we heard earlier how Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was stripped away by the Supreme Court. That was a number of years ago, and they just stripped away Section 2 very recently. So this is the other bookend piece. We have the For the People Act that tackles all these big things. It's this landmark piece of legislation. And then we also have HR 4, or what was HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It has not yet been introduced in the House or the Senate, but we hope that that comes next and that will restore those pieces of the Voting Rights Act. I also want to mention HR 51, the DC Admissions Act. You might hear people say, oh, well, DC statehood, that's unconstitutional, right? Well, no, the HR 51 carves out a federal district. It would create a new state for the over 700,000 residents of DC. And there's more people here in DC where I live than in Vermont or Wyoming. And it is an issue of racial justice. It's an issue of, again, fairness, of human dignity. And everyone here in DC deserves a right to vote, just like they do in all these other states where people, especially people of color, are having their votes suppressed by all these new voter suppression bills and laws. So that's a lot of information about these bills. You know, what can you do as a person? And in our small group, we heard a little bit about, oh, well, there's, you know, I didn't know about this. There's some despair about what's going on. You hear about all these things happening, but what can you do? Well, so this is the start, as Marianne said, of the Faith in Democracy Forum. And we were happy to have the Catholic Vigil event, if you will. And then tomorrow, and then on Thursday, there are about 20 events that are happening. If you go to faithfuldemocracy.us/forum, you can find the whole list of events over the next 2 days. And, you know, before we advocate, we need to educate ourselves. So maybe you just starting to learn about voter suppression tonight and you want to know more. Well, here's your opportunity. Go to faithfuldemocracy.us and you can sign up for some of these other webinars and check out some of the other resources on our page. And then once you educate, you can advocate. So you can join Faithful Democracy. Next week, we're having a call-in day, the July 28th, on a week from tomorrow. We want to tell our senators that we need them to pass the For the People Act. We also want them to let them know that, you know, August recess is coming up, but they shouldn't go home. They shouldn't go on break until they pass the For the People Act. So we have the 1-800 number right there. And you should call your senators and let them know we want the For the People Act. As people of faith, human beings have dignity and worth, and they shouldn't go home until they pass some legislation. And the other key part is that, you know, there's lots of talk about the filibuster. I know the Sisters of Mercy have taken a stance on the filibuster. We have not at FAN. But the key part, and we've agreed as a Faithful Democracy Coalition, that, you know, we can't let the filibuster stand in the way of these important democratic reforms, both HR 1, S1, and HR 4. The Congress has to find a way to get these things done. It's imperative. So that's about it from me. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Connect with us at FAN, connect with us at Faithful Democracy. Again, that's faithfuldemocracy.us. You can find more information about the rest of our Faith in Democracy Forum and find information about that call-in day next week as well.
Great, thank you so much, Jason. We had our call to action that we know that's now up to us to act, to think about the visuals that we can create to create a stir, whether it's on visuals on your social media feeds that show you taking action, you making phone calls, you know, a photo of you with a sign supporting the For the People Act. Those are all opportunities to engage others as well. That's a good part of the hope of this forum, was to educate folks and motivate more people. So now we all go and share what was most impactful to us with other people, and go forth and educate and advocate as we've just been invited to. So I'm going to check and see if there's any questions for Jason here. We've got some comments. One thing that people have mentioned is realizing they need to do some more research and learn what are the barriers to vote in their own state, in their own city. That's really important. As we've heard from Tracy, it's often hidden things that aren't the big headliners in the news or in academic studies, but that it is the the smaller things and these really subtle things that stand in the way of people to vote. So what we're going to be doing as the planning team is we are making a commitment to you that we are going to send some resources your way by early next week that will have some more things to ponder, reflect on, have some questions that you might think about, and how you might do some research about what barriers to voting rights there are in your community, in your state, and then also have some guidance how you can participate in the July 28th call-in day. Also, just something to put on your calendar for anyone who's within driving distance of Washington, D.C., is that there's going to be a big Democracy Day of Action on August 28th. And so there's groups that are calling people to DC to really show a strong show of force for all of these bills that Jason told us about. And I think that Tracy's experience also tells us that registering people to vote is really important, both the actual act of helping people to vote and help them overcome some of the barriers in the ways that Tracy did, I think is really important. And so I think there's lots of options for that. And Tracy is saying, if any of you are in North Carolina, she'd love partners for educating people on the importance of voting. So if any of you are in North Carolina, please say that in the chat, and we will get some names to Tracy to kind of build a coalition. So we're building a coalition and building a movement right here among us. So I want to thank everyone for joining. I am going to put one final slide on here because I would be so remiss of not making sure that I thank all the people that were so instrumental in putting this together. So we are going to go to this thank you so I don't forget people. And I apologize, for some reason I'm not able to put my, there we go. In a bigger picture for you, but that's a little better. So I really want to thank all of you for coming. It's really important to know that there's all these folks that wanted to spend some time, and we know there's another 200 and some people that registered for this and asked us for the recording. So we will be sharing that with them as well. And so Barita Singleton, who led us in our prayer, she was on our planning team. Angie McParland of the Mercy Justice team, Sister Diane Coury, Sister Rosemary Tresp, also of the Mercy Justice team, and then of course, Jason Miller. Thank them so much for planning this and developing our follow-up resources. And a huge thank you to Ana Flores, who is our wonderful tech support and is always the one to calm me before we have these kind of events and assure me everything's gonna work out well. And yet again, it did. So thank you so much, Ana, for that. So thank you to all, and I'm going to save the chat. So if there's any gems of things that you all shared, we can capture that, and we will wish you all a good night, and really hope that you will heed Jason's invitation to get involved on the July 28th and beyond, and look for that email we'll be sending you with more information and resources. So thank you and good night.